Hey everyone, and welcome back to the final tutorial of making your first 3D game in Unity. As of right now, we have our player able to walk around. He can shoot a gun at barrels. The barrels get knocked back, and we have a nice little terrain to walk around on. So if you haven't checked out the earlier tutorials, go ahead and check those out. But finally, we're going to add some enemies as well as the capability to obviously shoot the enemies as well as a health system, and we can die if our health gets too low. So let's go ahead and get started. First things first, we need to create our enemy. So if you right click again in the hierarchy and make a 3D object, we're going to do another capsule because I like capsules. And we're going to make this guy the same size as our player just so it seems even. And we're going to make it size 3. 3 by 3 by 3. The same as our player is right now. The player will actually be seeing this capsule, so it's not going to work to have the boring, bland, white capsule texture that all capsules have. So if you click on element 0, or go to the capsule, and first things first, actually let's rename him to enemy, just so we know what we're dealing with. Now, this is all created when you create the capsule. So if you go to Mesh Renderer Component in the inspector, under Materials, there's a drop-down. There's right now the default material, which is the white. If you click on the circle, click on the eye texture, which is included in the Unity package in the description, as well as this full project. So now you have the eye, and you can see that now this capsule is nice and green and monster and all scary and whatnot. So before we actually get started with making the enemy move, we need to add a couple more things. So to begin with, we already have the collider for this capsule, so that's good. But we should add a rigid body so it falls and it's not flying in the air and goes under gravity and stuff like that. And then we are also going to create, of course, an enemy script for the player, or for the enemy. So you can hit new script and then create a new script in C# and then add it to the enemy. So with that, we actually can create a prefab for this enemy. So if you remember, you can go to the project, right click, hit create, and we're going to click on prefab once again. And we're going to call this one enemy. So hold on for a second because it's got to import small assets, I guess. And so once that's done, you can go ahead and drag the enemy in your hierarchy to the enemy prefab that you just created in your project. Now, if you remember what a prefab is, it's basically just a copy and paste way to create objects in your scene. So now we have our enemy in the scene, and then we can just, add some more inside of there. So to actually go about making the enemy AI kind of work, we're going to go for some very simple AI, which is just going to walk directly towards the player. So we're going to set a private game object, capital game object, target for the target of the enemy, and then we're going to add a private float move speed, and we're just going to set that to 5 just so the monsters are small and we can outrun them. In the start, we're going to have to set that target, and since the target's not going to be changing, this makes sense to do it in the start method, so you're not doing it every frame, so it doesn't slow down your game. And we can do target equals game object. We're going to do capital game object dot find. Now, I named my player object just player, but if you named it something else, you'll have to call it something else in here as well. So now that we have the target player found, we actually need to move towards it. So what we can do is we can create a vector3 direction, and then I'm going to make it so it's target dot transform dot position minus this dot transform dot position. And what that'll do is it'll take the target position, which is the player. It's going to take my position, the enemy, and then I'm going to do dot normalize. And what that does is it basically creates a unit vector between the two. Don't worry about it too much, but it basically just gets the direction from the player to the target, or player to the enemy, and vice versa. Then we're going to multiply that direction by a good move speed, so it's always going to be going at that constant speed. And then Finally, we're going to do transform dot position plus equals that direction, and then times time dot delta time. You should be used to that time dot delta time by now. It's just a way to smooth out your movements because of the varying frame rate. And then you'll notice that we're actually modifying the transform directly instead of using like a character controller like we did for our player. This makes more sense using directly modifying it when you're working with a flat surface like we are. We're just modifying very simple stuff. If there were slopes, if we're going up those mountains, it would make more sense to use the character controller. In this case, this totally works fine, so we're just going to roll with this. And then finally, we're going to do transform dot look at, and then we're going to do target dot transform dot position. And what this does is it just makes sure that the enemy is always looking directly at the player, so it's keeping that eye contact, and then so your enemy doesn't look like it's sliding to the left or walking backwards or anything. It's always going to move forward. So with that, our enemy is now complete. So if we go ahead and let that compile for a second, then once we hit play, you should be able to see that our enemies will look towards us and walk towards us as we run around. So there's our enemy. It's keeping eye contact as we move around, and then they're always moving towards us. So if I go ahead and now if I shoot them, you can see they're just being knocked back, similar to the barrels we're getting knocked back, but we don't really want to worry about that too much. So go ahead back to the player, and we're going to work on some stuff. So first things first, we need to actually create a private game object, and then this is going to be the enemy prefab, and this is how our enemies are going to be spawned. So we need to actually spawn these somehow. So we're going to create that. We're going to create a private int, and we're going to call this num enemies, and then I'm going to set that equal to 10, and then we're going to make a private float wave timer. And what this will do is basically every 15 seconds 10 enemies will spawn, and feel free to modify that as much as you want. Just remember that the shoot timer delay is 3/4 of a second, so 15 or 10 enemies in 15 seconds, you should be totally fine. And then while we're here, we're going to add a private int to be health, and we're just going to start that at 100, so 100% as well. So we're actually going to have to go through here, and we're going to work on our bullet shot. So if it doesn't have a rigid body, then it's going to do nothing. So right now, our enemies do have a rigid body, but we don't want to knock them back. We want to actually destroy them. So at the start, we're going to do if the ray hit dot transform dot name dot contains, and then we named our prefab enemy. So if it has enemy in the name, then what we're going to do is we're just going to actually destroy the ray hit, because remember that's how our raycast work. The ray hit dot transform dot game object, and basically whenever we shoot an enemy, it will instantly get killed. And then just so there's not other stuff happening after, we're going to make this an else if, so it's not destroyed and then it tries to knock it back, because that's going to cause some issues. So our player is now capable of taking life into its own hands. It can now kill enemies, but we should make this fair, and the enemies should be able to kill us as well. So we're going to make a new function, and it's going to call on collision enter, and then inside of it we're going to do collision other. Now make sure on collision enter is capitalized, on collision is capitalized, and enter is capitalized. That's because this is another Unity specific method which basically checks to see if two objects are colliding. So because our enemies have a collider as well as our player has a collider, we can tell whenever they're colliding, of course. So we should check to see if the other dot game object dot name dot contains, again, enemy, And so this just makes sure that we're not bumping into any barrels that shouldn't be bumped into. And so if an enemy ever touches us, it's going to kamikaze into us and we're going to lose 5 health. But because it kamikazed into us, we need to destroy the game object just as well. So we can just do other.gameObject.destroy, and now it is totally gone forever. One last thing, we need to actually spawn these enemies. So we're going to create another function we'll just call spawn enemy. And all this is going to do, I must have forgotten a semicolon or a parenthesis. There it is. All this is going to do is just a for loop to go through and what did I call it? Num enemies. Just go through and it will spawn the number of enemies that we have in the scene that we decided, and we're just going to randomly spawn them in a circle around the player. So I'm going to do random.insideUnitCircle times 100. So inside of this 100 circle radius, an enemy will spawn. And then because it's a circle, I need to actually swap the Z and Y values so the enemy isn't spawning in the sky and falling down. And then we set the Y, which is the up and down, to be 0, so it's on the ground. Then, because we're doing the spawn position around the player, we're going to do plus equals transform.position, which is the player position. And then finally, we need to actually spawn the enemy. So instantiate takes in the enemy prefab, then it needs to take in the spawn position, and then it's going to take in a quaternion.identity, which is basically just a fancy way of saying no rotation, keep it as default rotation. So with that, we should now have a enemy spawn method. But how do we call it? Inside of the start method, actually, believe it or not, we're going to call this invoke repeating method. Now what this does is it will spawn, or it'll call a method as often as we say. So I'm going to do spawn enemy, which is what we called it, spawn enemy, and then comma 5, and then comma wave timer. What this will do is it'll wait 5 seconds at the start, it will then spawn enemies, and then every 15 seconds it will call spawn enemy again. So this is a way so you don't have to keep track of the timer yourself, it'll keep track of the timer for you. And so once everything is all said and done, last but not least, we're going to modify our GUI real quick so we can see how much health we have remaining. So new rectangle to be 20, 20. We'll make the width to be 200. The height is going to be 100. And then we can just say health remaining is going to be health. And that's it. Nothing too crazy. So once everything is all said and done, assuming I have no errors, which I do not. So it's giving me a warning that enemy prefab is never assigned to, and that is correct because I actually meant to make this public. So enemy prefab should be public. And with that, what we can do now is in the player, on the player object, inside of the inspector, once it's done compiling, you can see that we now have the enemy prefab object inside of our script. So then we can either just drag on enemy onto that, or we can hit the little circle and find our enemy in there. So once everything is all said and done, I'm going to go ahead and actually delete all of these enemies already in the game. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the play button, and let's see some magic happen. So you can see in the top left we have our health remaining to be 100, and oh, there's some enemies, so I'm going to go ahead and shoot them, shoot them, shoot them, looking good. I'm going to go run into one of them, and then boom, you can see that we lost 5 health as well as the enemy is destroyed. So, and then give it a couple more seconds, and there you go. More enemies have now spawned, and they are wreaking havoc all over our beautiful grass fortress arena thing. So that's looking great to me. Last but not least, let's add a little something extra. So 2 things actually inside of our Unity thing. We're going to add one more component inside on our player, and we're actually going to add an audio source. And then inside of audio clip, we're going to click on the little circle, and then you can click on gunshot. Now what this is going to do is just going to give some feedback to our player on whenever we shoot the gun. So that was in our if input dot get mouse button down. We can then do, what do then we do? We then do get component, audio source, because that's what our component is called, and then we can just do dot play, empty parentheses. It would make more sense to save that audio source at the start, but this is totally fine by me. It will not slow your game down too much. So now whenever we shoot, we'll get that shot thing, and then one other thing is we should check to see if our health is ever below 0, or our health is ever too low, so less than or equal to 0. What we should do is we should just restart the game, and we can do that by calling application dot load level, and then in the parentheses we can do application dot loaded level. And what that'll do is that'll just restart the same level that we're on. So what we can do is we can go in here, and assuming everything works perfectly, we now have our fully completed game. Well done. I shouldn't celebrate too soon. So let's go ahead and, yep, there we go. Our gunshot is working pretty good. And then you can see that as we're clicking rapidly, it's only going off once, and then, yep, they're going correctly. So now if I go ahead and suicide into a lot of enemies, what can happen is, boop, where are my more enemies? I need more to spawn. There we go. Let's see where we're at. Not sure what that one is doing back there, but that's okay. Probably should have set the health a bit higher so we can die quicker, but we are almost there. 5 and one more, and then boom, there you go. We are currently reset, and then they're spawning again. One thing to notice, it did get a little bit dark right there. That is an issue, I think, with Unity 5, so I don't have a full answer for you. If you come up here to Window and then hit Lighting, I've heard that if you just change this to be off of Auto and then hit Build, it should work just fine, but that's a future tutorial. So congratulations on making your first 3D game. Feel free to add some extra stuff on this. You can add some more enemies that have different health. You can add them so they actually have health, so it takes more than one shot. Make some exploding barrels, make some better guns. Feel free to leave your comments below. Leave your ideas in the comments below. And if there's a tutorial you want to see in the future, please, please, please let me hear it. I am here for you guys. If you have any questions, any comments, any feedback, please let me know. I really hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.